What's up, everyone? Today, we're starting a new series called Real, where we're going to be talking about real friendships. Now, many of us have, at some point in our lives, had these friends who we maybe thought were our friends, but then they acted in a way or they said something that kind of made us question if they were real friends. And maybe you'd even use that other word to describe them. You'd say that they were fake. And that brings us to an important question as we're getting started talking about friendship, which is, what is a real friend? Now, you might say that a real friend is someone who has been with you since day one, right? Or they've stuck with you through a difficult time or treated you maybe the way that you wanted to be treated. I think a lot of us could even probably name someone who has been a real friend to us. But I'm also guessing that there are some of us here today who are still unsure if any of our current friends are actually real friends. How can we really know if someone is a real friend, a true good friend? For the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about and seeing if we can discover what a real friend actually is. And as we do, I hope that we'll discover not only how we can find more real friends in our lives, but also how we can be real friends as well. See, I can still remember very vividly the time that my friend Brent told me about a girl that he had a crush on for the very first time. We were pretty young. We were in like 7th grade. So up until this point, we weren't really thinking that much about like dating and that kind of thing. It wasn't really on our radar. But this girl that Brent had a crush on was someone from our church friend group. So it felt like a really big deal. He was kind of the first one of our friend group to do this. So as you may or may not know, when you hit 7th grade, you automatically become like an instant expert on all things dating, right? So I had tons of advice for Brent on how he should try and charm her, like all of those sorts of things, right? How he can like try and win her over. So a little time goes by, and it ends up that myself and this girl that Brent had a crush on were the very last ones left at church this one night, waiting for our parents to come and pick us up. And I don't know what came over me, but all of a sudden, I just had the most brilliant idea. I should tell this girl that Brent has a crush on her, right? Like that would be totally helpful for me to do. Honestly, I wasn't really thinking, but this just kind of like mist came over me that was like, this is the thing you have to do. And so I was like, I just got to do it. I just had this urge and I was like, hey, just so you know, Brent is in love with you. Yeah. So this girl did not like Brent in that way, and me telling her actually ended up causing a ton of drama in our friend group that really could have been avoided if I had just honored Brent and been more careful with what he shared with me. See, one of the most difficult things about friendship, which all of us have experienced, is that friendship always involves 2 or more humans. And humans are broken, messy creatures, right? We all have different backgrounds, different burdens, different needs, different ways of seeing the world. And that can make friendship really, really tricky. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at this story where Jesus is interacting with 3 of his most beloved friends. It's these 3 siblings named Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And something particularly wild we're going to see in this story is that Jesus' love for each of his friends, in this love, he responds to each of them differently in just the way that they need. See, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived in this area of Israel called Bethany. You might remember those names, Mary and Martha, from this other story in the Bible where Jesus visits their house, and Mary and Martha are trying to get all ready. Martha's cleaning the house. She's like cooking. She's getting stuff ready. But Mary just kind of like sits down with Jesus and hangs out with him. And Martha gets all mad and she's like, Jesus, tell my sister to help me. And Jesus actually says, you know what? What Mary's doing, just sitting with me, that's a really good thing to do. That's what you should do too. You should sit with me. It's this kind of strange story. And these friends are friends who Jesus loves and has a deep friendship with. But before we read this passage, there's something that we need to remind ourselves of about Jesus. That's that Jesus was a human. Now, that might seem obvious, but I think oftentimes when we think about Jesus and the things he did and the way that he lived his life, we're often like, well, of course he did all of these right things, right? Like, of course he was a good friend. He's Jesus, he's God. But Jesus had to interact with broken and messy people. Jesus had to work hard to be loving in his friendships. Jesus had to choose to listen well and to care for others because he was around messy, broken, and even annoying people. The fact that Jesus was a human is the reason that we can look to him as an example of how to live lives that are full of flourishing. So, as we jump into this passage, here's what we need to know. This guy, Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, he's sick. And people from his community come and find Jesus to let him know that he's sick. And Jesus plans to go to Bethany, but before he goes, Lazarus ends up dying. But Jesus had other plans, and he heads to Bethany anyways. It says in John chapter 11, starting in verse 17, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and to Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed back at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied, I believe that you're the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. So we read in our passage, right off the bat, that Lazarus has already been dead for many days by the time that Jesus gets to Bethany, and the people very naturally are distraught. Right? As would have been the custom, people from all of the surrounding communities would come together to weep and mourn the death of somebody who they knew. So they're all gathered to mourn, and Jesus shows up. And then we read that Mary runs out to greet Jesus, Martha runs out to greet Jesus, but Mary, who's probably too overcome by her grief, she stays at home. She can't even get outside to see Jesus. And then we see that Jesus does something really interesting. He almost kind of lectures Martha, right? She says, if you would have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And Jesus kind of says, Martha, do you remember who I am? Let's talk about the truths that we know. And it's not because he's mad at her. It's because we see actually in just a few verses, Mary's going to say the same thing to Jesus, and he responds totally differently, which shows us something really really wonderful here, that Jesus is intentional. Jesus is intentional in his friendships. Now, you might have heard that word before. It's not really a word that we talk about too often, but to be intentional means to take the time and energy to consider not just what we would like to do or say in a situation, but to consider who we're interacting with and what their needs are in a given situation. So think back to my friend Brent, right? Fast forward just a few years, my friend Brent is the very first person who told me about liking a girl in our friend group. And at the end of 9th grade, it was my turn to confide in Brent something. See, there was this girl, Chelsea, who I had a crush on at the time. I really liked her, but my friend Brent was close friends with her. And he warned me, like when I started kind of showing interest, he warned me, see, Chelsea, she's really great, but she kind of gets bored when she starts dating people. Like she'll date them for a couple months and then she'll be kind of tired of it. And I was like, yeah. But Brent, this is me we're talking about. I'm so charming. You know, I'll be the one that kind of breaks the curse. I'll be the one who she like stays interested in. Well, here's the thing. I started dating Chelsea, and 3 months in, she told me she just wanted to be friends. She didn't want to keep dating. It's very sad. You might know what that feels like. It's very hard. So the first thing I do is I think back to this moment where Brent warned me. But I knew the kind of friend Brent was. So I went over to Brent's house. I told him Chelsea broke up with me. And instead of saying, well, I told you so, instead of saying, you should have listened to me, I knew, Brent just said, you were a great boyfriend to her, and the next person you date you're going to be a great boyfriend to them too. I remember having this moment of realizing Brent was an intentional friend. He was the opposite of the type of friend I was to him a few years previously. Because being intentional means taking the time not just to do something, but to lovingly consider the why behind what you do before you do it. See, in the story with Jesus, he knew his friend Martha so deeply. He knew not only what she needed from him in that particular moment, but he also knew how to go about offering it to her in a way that would bless her, build her up, and encourage her. So I want you to consider for a moment the friendships that you have in your life. When you think of this way of interacting with others, of being intentional, can you think of many people who are actually intentional with how they act and with what they do? When Jesus was a lovingly intentional friend to his friends, it wasn't just because he was God and it was like easy for him. It was because he was setting an example for us on how to be a true, real friend. Most of us have been on the receiving end of a careless friend, someone who doesn't take the time to think about how what they're going to do affects you before they do it. Maybe there have even been times where you've been that type of friend to people. But as we head into our life groups, I'd love for you to consider just 3 questions. The first one is, how often do you think about the effects of your actions before you do them? Do you just do whatever you're feeling like doing in your friendships in that moment, whatever your feelings tell you should do? Or are you thinking about how to bless the people in your life with how you love and care for them? The second one, how could your friendships look different if you were more intentional in them? Would it impact your relationships, your friendships, if you really acted in this way? What would be some benefits that come out of it? Or what are some things that would maybe be scary about loving in this way? And lastly, how can you find real friends who will be intentional? Think about some of the friendships that you have in your life that don't look this way. Why do you feel like you're maybe drawn to those friendships instead of real ones? Do you feel like those are real friendships, or maybe they're more transactional? See, real friendship isn't about being perfect or surrounding ourselves with people who don't make mistakes. Real friendship means looking and moving in the right direction and trying to help others do the same thing, which is towards Jesus. That's why it's so important to remember that real friendships are intentional. Let's head to our life groups together.